As I review the material on the Tao Te Ching, the standard academic material, I'm reminded again how 30 years ago I was disimpressed by the academic treatment of esoteric Chinese thought. And I'm reminded again how completely inadequate most of the world-famous authors and textbooks are in terms of the Tao Te Ching. And I just hope that you are able to understand that my understanding from this comes firsthand from 5 years of being with a Chinese mentor in San Francisco and spending about another quarter of a century assiduously studying myself on the material. And 2 years ago, in order to check myself out, since my mentor had died in 1975, I went to see Master Niwa Ching, who was about the only verifiable Taoist master in the United States, and checked myself out personally with him. And he gave me the same kind of okay that my teacher gave, that my understanding of this is very Chinese and very accurate, and I am able to teach this, to convey this. One aspect that will come out of this teaching is that you will be able to appreciate how the Chinese mind actually works. And out of this, why it is that Chinese civilization is one of the great treasures of the planet. Now, the Tao Te Ching is in 81 chapters, but these 81 chapters were given to this text around 50 BC during the Han Dynasty. And the Han Chinese are the Roman Chinese. In other words, there was an emperor at the top of a pyramid of pecking order. Han Wuti had 130,000 people working for him. So that the Han Chinese was a bureaucratic state only in service of one person. And the Han instituted the Chinese civil service that lasted up until 1911. And they reduced all of the text material of classical China down to a handful of books. And only another handful of books survived a book burning, which took place around 210 BC. So that when you look to find authentic Chinese classics in the BC centuries, there are not enough to even make a shelf as wide as this table. So there is very little actual written evidence, but the few things that have survived have a correlative pattern of intelligence to them, which I will try to deliver to you. So in the course of this series, I will bring forth for your appreciation all 100% of the classic Chinese texts. And as we get deeper into it, I will bring other materials from Chinese civilization so that you can appreciate that you are actually learning something of value. You will find that you're able to appreciate the Chinese mind and understand that with an almost unerring accuracy over 2 millennia, the Chinese experience of life has been recognizable to themselves. Now, we last week started with the Tao, and this week we're going with the Te. For the name of our book, Tao Te Ching, actually means Ching is a book, but it's a special kind of a book. It's a book, the English term for it would be canon. It's an authentic book. at the root of a tradition. And so a Ching like the I Ching, or the Tao Te Ching, or the Shu Ching, or the Shi Ching, the book of poetry, the book of history, the book of changes, the book of the Tao Te. Both these words, Tao Te, are appended in the earliest editions of the book. Before there were 81 chapters, there were only two sections of the book, the section on Te and the section on Tao. And in the earliest strata, the section on Te came first. Now we're going to take a look at chapter 38 of the Tao Te Ching tonight, because it is the beginning of this current, this waterfall of discourse, which is in the Te section of the Tao Te Ching. The number one thing to keep in mind here is that for the Chinese, the Tao is an unnumberable, an innumerable, a non-designatable quality which transcends all attempts to describe it. And so Tao must have a zero designation. But when Tao comes into play, it must have a form in which it comes into play, a form which gives it stability, which manifests it, and that form is what we would commonly call oneness. Even metaphysically, the sense of unity with a capital U, the oneness, so that the Te is the beginning of all designatable, all assignable by language name, by philosophic discrimination, by human appreciation. Te is the beginning. And so tonight we're going to take a look at Te. The standard history in English of Chinese philosophy, and it is also the standard in Chinese, in the original language, is A History of Chinese Philosophy by Feng Yulan. The first volumes were published in the early 1930s in China, and they were translated in the 1950s and published by Princeton University Press. I bought my set in Madison, Wisconsin in 1961. I was studying at the University of Wisconsin at that time. Feng Yulan does not understand Lao Tzu. Though he is the great authority on Chinese philosophy and on the later development of Chinese philosophy, he is incredibly refined. And as soon as you get into the schools, like there was a school called the Tao Chia, he is masterful there. He is masterful all the way through Sung thought, Yuan thought, the Neo-Confucians, Ming thought, the contemporary Chinese philosophic scene. But excuse me, he does not understand Lao Tzu at all. And in fact, like a die-hard, uptight, super-laced Confucian, he dates Lao Tzu several centuries after Confucius. He dates him in the 3rd century BC, saying that he is a contemporary of people like Chuangzi and Mencius and so forth, and that it isn't even a person, but it's a committee. Now, there is no one who has ever seriously read the Tao Te Ching that will maintain that this is written by a committee. The more that you refine yourself, the more that the book occurs to you as an incredible, expressive spectrum of a single personality. The Tao Te Ching, like the Iliad or the Odyssey, is clearly the product of a superior human being. Someone who is totally masterful on a complete range of expressivity, who has mastered language to such an extent that he can modulate what he writes, what he expresses, to convey nuances that normally would not be available for apperception. Thus, inexperienced academic minds, and by inexperienced I mean to say that they have no meditative or contemplative prowess. It's quite a different thing to be able to envision interiorly meaning from being able to scholarly make quotations and cite references. It's an exactly polar process. Now, when we come to Feng Yulan, Lao Tzu and his School of Taoism, Volume 1, page 179, he will write at the bottom and on the following page these words about Tao and Te, and I just give them to you so that you can form some appreciation for what I am rejecting. As the Han Fai Tzu says, and the Han Fai Tzu is another book written by a man who lived in the Han Dynasty, hence Han, and the Tzu is master, and his name, family name, was centered around Fei, and so he's called Han Fai Tzu. As the Han Fai Tzu says, Tao brings the principles of all things into single agreement. Therefore, it can be both one thing and another, and is not in one thing only. Feng Yulan, about 1931, comments, it is fundamentally incapable of having any name applied to it, and so when we term it Tao, we are simply forcing a name to it. So far, so well. Feng Yulan. Tao, then, is the all-embracing first principle for all things. No, it is not the first principle. It cannot be designated at all. Second sentence, Te, a word usually translated in English as virtue, but which in many cases would be better translated as the efficacy or power inherent in a thing, is the principle underlying each individual thing. Again, this is a reductive error. No Taoist would ever talk this way. Te is not in things. There are no things. On that deep level where Tao manifests as Te, there are no things. This same kind of reductive mind, later on, will take the 5-phase energy cycle and its correlative, the 5 elements, and reduce the 5 elements mentally to things, so that earth, air, fire, water, metal will become things, categorical ascriptions, and that is completely incorrect. And we'll see next week, when we look at the 5-phase energy cycle, that this is a network of process. This is an ongoing pattern of unfoldment. This is an ecology of phase form occurrence. And when the appreciator comes into sync with the process at the nodes of its transformation, it appears as if things occur. But a Taoist understands that what really is happening is that change is modulated, and as it shifts phase, there is a momentary thusness which is revealed, which seems to be the thingness which everybody is talking about, but is completely evanescent, doesn't really occur. so that the reality is not in the thing, but in the phase in which it is occurring. Now, I won't go any further into this because you can see the tone here. One last designation here. The Kwanzaa, Kuan-Tzu, the Kwanzaa, and Kwanzaa was a legendary philosopher who died about 645 BC, and whose book is in fact a compendium. And there was a translation of about a third of it done by Hong Kong University Press in 1965. Feng Yulan writes, the Kwanzaa, chapter 36, says, Te is the dwelling place of Tao. This is incorrect. Te is not the dwelling place of Tao. Human-heartedness is the dwelling place of Tao. Zhen. There is a reductiveness which makes causality implicit, and that is completely wrong. There is no such sense that Tao causes Te. Tao is not something which then affects some other thing called Te, which then affects some other thing. The Tao is mysterious and not there at all. Because of Te, a correspondence with Zhen and Tao is possible. The human-heartedness is the dwelling place of Tao, so that man has a very honorable place in Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching. Man is the bridge between heaven and earth. Man is not just the bridge in some kind of reductive way. He is the bridge in a resonant way. Because only when man is real, and he is real by balancing the yin-yang interiorly, and when that is completely in equanimity, he occurs spontaneously with the Tao. And whatever he does, the earth also then participates resonantly with the Tao and his own human-heartedness. Now, the first discovery of this in China was made in the mountains, so that the Chinese character for mountain, shan, has 3 lines, the center one very high, and then a base. And the Chinese character for mountain, shan, is the esoteric symbol for that person who balances heaven and earth with his own mountainous human-heartedness, his own equanimity of yin and yang, and thereby creates the real for the first time. The Tao is unconcerned with the real. The earth is unconcerned with the real. When man, in his excellence, is concerned with the real, heaven and earth both are then also resonantly concerned with the real. So that later on in Chinese poetry or Chinese landscape painting, the favorite phrase that's used of the paradise of the Chinese expectation is mountains and rivers without end. The flow of the Tao is the rivers, and the mountains, those individuals who manifest the resonance of the real, who bridge heaven and earth. So that population of saints, if you like, and the flow of the Tao, encapsulated by the great phrase, mountains and rivers without end. Coming back to Feng Yulan and his quotation from the Kwanzaa, chapter 36, Te is the dwelling place of Tao. Things obtain it from Tao so as to be produced. Living things obtain it so as to function. It is the essence of Tao. Therefore, Te is an obtaining. This means that through obtaining which a thing is what it is. Through obtaining, a thing becomes what it is. That which is doing nothing, Wu Wei, is called Tao. The dwelling place of this is Te. Therefore, there is no separation between Tao and Te. This is an error. It's a fundamental error of a reductive mind. It's actually a sign of a flawed intelligence. There is no equation of Tao equals Te whatsoever. You cannot substitute Te for Tao. You cannot substitute Tao for Te. They're not in equivalency. They do not occupy an identity. In Taoism, when something occurs, in the very next phase, there is a complete sense of mysteriousness between the two of them. So that one would never talk about the one causing the other. The one does not have a causal relationship to the zero. But the next phase, the next occurrence, has a correspondence with the previous, the one previous. I call this grandfather phasing because it's an easy way to remember. You can call it grandmother phasing if you like. So that every other place has correspondence. So that the whole Chinese notion of science, the whole Chinese notion of poetry, the Chinese notion of mysticism, the Chinese notion of philosophy in the deepest sense, the Chinese sense of humanity and valuation, are all based on these Taoist correspondences and in no way are ever causally reductive. Later on, in the Han Dynasty, when there were whole patterns that were developed, patterns of correspondence, secondary figures made the reduction in terms of the patterns of correspondence. And so you get reductiveness in causality, and you get later on reductiveness in patterns, which leads to a kind of system building, which leads to false correspondences. And so people ended up being permanently stupid. And the Han Dynasty, when it finally fell, left China in a kind of a chaos that lasted until the founding of the Tang some 400 years later. Let's go to the Tao Te Ching. Let's go to chapter 38. And let me give you first-hand reading of this momentous beginning. When we look at chapter 38, there are two characters at the beginning, Lun Te. Now the character for Lun also appears at the head of the book which is ascribed to Confucius. The Lun Yu of Confucius is usually translated as the Analects of Confucius, the wise sayings of Confucius. This same character here, Lun Te, means that this little section is a discussion, a pithy discussion about Te. And it begins, and it has 5 discernible sections, 5 discernible phases to the discussion. The first phase initiates it, and the first 2 characters that come out are Shang Te. Shang meaning superior, and the Chinese character for Shang, or superior, is the horizon and the line rising from the center, just as you would find in the character for Shang. Only instead of the two resonant lines, the shorter ones, there is a single line coming out from the top of the, or the middle of the rising line. So Shang has a single horizontal line, a single vertical line, and a line off the center. The second character is the character for Te. Now, as to Feng Yulan and many other academicians of the 30s and 40s and 50s and even on into the 60s, translating Te as virtue, this comes because the English language was using a Victorian translation of Plato's term, which they translated it as virtue. Plato's term is arete, and in no sense means virtue. Virtue, incidentally, in English comes from Latin, and in the Latin, the sense of virtue or virtuous essentially comes from the manliness of something. And this is a misunderstanding of Plato and of Lao Tzu. So that we'll just use the term Te, because we can learn to use Te just like we can learn to use Tao. We don't have to translate Tao. We will get a sense for using the term Tao. We'll get a sense of using the term Te. And as I go through this today, you'll build a sense for the Chinese language, for Lao Tzu's language, because I will show you just how he uses Chinese language very specifically. He patterns it in such a way that instead of a line of discourse developing, he makes an arc of meaning which has parallels and correspondences in all of the rest of the character developments. So that instead of lines of text, there are really arcs of text. So that Lao Tzu is writing in the same kind of way that Matisse would draw a figure. He's using a vibrant line to describe a motion in the mind. It's a line of language that sketches, with the brilliance of a consummate artist, a series of lines that together will make an aesthetic portrait of an understanding. So Lao Tzu's Chinese is not a blocky kind of instruction. It's not an instruction which you have to follow, but it is instead an artistic demonstration which you have to appreciate. So the first two characters, the character for superior and the character for Te, Shang Te. And then the third character, Bu, actually is a kind of a negative in Chinese. It means not. If you ask someone in beginning Chinese, the first phrase that you learn is Ni Hao Ma. Ni Hao means how are you, and the Ma is just a phonetic sound of politeness. Like the Japanese sometimes say Ne, or the Chinese say Ma. Ni Hao Ma. And if you're not feeling well, you would reply Bu Ma. It's a not, it's a negative. And so the third character is a negative. Shang Te, Bu Te. The fourth character is also Te, the same character, so that Te occurs twice, the second character and the fourth character. Then there are two characters that together mean therefore. Two little characters, she and E, together, that just mean therefore. Shang Te, Bu Te, therefore. Now notice that therefore expects that you have understood, that you have been told something. What have you been told? You've been told something that is a differential. What have you differentiated? You've differentiated superior te and not te. Whatever they are, therefore, and then follows this phrase, yin, yu, te. It has virtue. So that when you look at the beginning of chapter 38, there are two characters that mean superior te, two characters that mean not te, two characters that mean therefore, and two characters that mean it has te. So what Lao Tzu has done in language is he has demonstrated for you a little bit of a pyrotechnic of grammar. He's saying that superior virtue and not virtue, therefore it has virtue. Now, the way that translators pick this up is legendary. Joseph Needham, who was in China in the 1930s, said that he counted more than 300 translations of the Tao Te Ching in various languages then, and more than 700 commentaries in Chinese literature on it. So more than 1,000 people had tried, one way or another, to wrestle with the Tao Te Ching. Why? Because it is a great work of art. It is not appreciable by someone who cannot flow with the language. Now, as soon as Lao Tzu has put down superior te, not te, therefore is te, he comes back with a contrast, a second arc, or a second line, if you're visualizing it still linearly, but it's a second arc. The second arc begins with the phrase inferior te, hia te, inferior te. The first arc begins with superior te, not te, therefore has te. Inferior te, and then the characters bu, shi, te, not loses te. Just a little bit of a difference in the second line. Superior te, not te. Inferior te, not loses te. Therefore, and the same two little characters for therefore, it has no te. Now, if you're looking with a kind of a logical mind that is based on equivalences, that locates things in terms of identity, this is completely stymieing already. What Lao Tzu is demonstrating for us, though, is that there is a slight differentiation which will occur as a gestalt if you will leave the language to just flow in its own way. He's encouraging us to learn to see interior gestalts of meaning. Borrow your pen for a second. If we have a sheet and I draw just a couple of lines, what do you see? A cat. Everyone can see a cat. This is like Lao Tzu's technique. Like a Matisse, he does not have to give us every single line. Why? Because he's not talking about things. He's talking to evoke from us the appreciation of a gestalt. He wants us to be up out of the clumsy level at which we're determined to understand things in a plodding way. He wants us to forget that. Rise up out of that series of categorical boxes into the air above it. Now the Taoist sense here, being very Chinese, is that when you cook rice, the fragrance of the cooking rice is in the vapor, in the steam. That is the qi of the rice. It makes you hungry to appreciate and go and eat that rice. So that the qi is not some kind of vacuous, metaphysical, stand-in concept. It is the graphic invitation that this is for you. Come and participate with it. The rice is fresh, it's delicious, and the thing to do is go and eat it. So the same thing is happening here in Lao Tzu with his language. He's saying, Tao Te is very good for us, very nutritious for us, but you have to come and get it. And because it's not a thing but a gestalt, you have to come in a way in which you are ready to accept gestalts and appreciate their fullness. And in implication, Lao Tzu is saying, you are not a thing. You are also a highly dynamic gestalt. And because you have thought that you were such and such a thing, because you were convinced I have such and such an identity, you missed understanding yourself in the true fullness in which you are. So by this invitation, you are not only being invited to appreciate the Tao and the Te, but to bring your own Zhen, your own human-heartedness into play, and thus recursively, retrospectively, appreciate yourself. That you can see in a few lines a gestalt of a cat is an indication that you can complete a figure inside of yourself intuitionally. And if you will just allow your intuition space to breathe, it will complete gestalts and patterns that are almost impossible to complete in a very clumsy, materialistic way. How do you know when you've drawn enough lines to make a cat? When you've got it down to some several thousand lines of a graphic reprint of some cat, is that enough lines? Even if you had 25,000 lines of a graphic cat, it would not be a cat. It would only be a sketch with lines. But the gestalt is different because it is completed in you. That gestalt lives with your life. And so our human-heartedness in perceiving Tao by a gestalt technique of intuition, we become a correspondent resonance with it. We appropriate it in ourselves. And so our Zhen, our human-heartedness, gets the infusion of the Tao. And we are able to participate in the kind of resonance that the Te makes, which will be something else. Something which we will call Yi. The Chinese call it Yi. And we'll see that what is the Yi are what we would generally call symbols. That what is resonant with the Te are the symbols, the Yi. And that these two pairs of resonances, when they're in sync, make the world. And the world is real when these two pairs are in sync. When this quaternity, which starts mysteriously with the Tao and includes us, and it starts graphically, formally with the Te and includes our mental images, the symbols, these two sets brought into a larger correspondence, a larger correlative resonance, allow for the world to occur. And we'll see that this is exactly what's happening. Let's come back to the beginning, and let's take our two lines, or two beginning arcs. Shang Te, Bu Te. Therefore, it has Te. Inferior Te not loses Te, therefore it has no Te. In other words, you cannot grab in any way, because when you have grabbed in any way, you have nothing. Te is a principle of oneness, and that oneness is a unity without dismemberment. A unity without dismemberment. So using the term virtue is kind of like an approximation. When you say someone is virtuous, you mean to say that they're intact. Well, but Te is intact on a level that no morality would ever be intact. Is impossible. If you observe 1 million rules of moral behavior perfectly for 1 million years, you would still not be perfected the way in which the unity of Te is perfected instantaneously. So you cannot grab for something, so that an inferior Te, in its haste to not lose Te, has no Te at all. Then Lao Tzu comes back immediately in the third arc, back to Shang Te. He never lets us get into disorder, never lets us stray. If we're looking at resonances and correspondences, the Tao Te Ching always rewards us because it is there every single time. The masterfulness of Lao Tzu, like the masterfulness of Matisse, you never see a line that's out of place. Never. So that every undulation of a line has a genuineness which can be appreciated. And if you can't appreciate it, it's because you haven't yet deepened enough to appreciate it, not because it isn't there. It's like someone who says, well, they can't appreciate the music on the string quartets of Beethoven. It's not because the string quartets of Beethoven are not very excellent music, they just haven't matured enough. They haven't understood the musical form enough. They haven't understood timbre and pitch and development enough. And when they do, they will say, these are marvelous, like everyone else will say. Not because of rules, but because the appreciative quality is attainable. And the Tao is that way. We can come to appreciate Tao so refinedly that when it occurs in someone, we occur with them. And one of the beauties of the Chinese worldview is the ineffable indelibleness of great friends. A great friend, someone that you have resonated with in correspondence with the Tao, is an eternal friend. Where could this harmony ever disband to? It has flown back into eternity, and we are sealed forever with its excellence. Later on, the Buddhists, when they come into China, will appreciate this quality, and they will begin to make their own translations. When they go to use a Chinese term to translate sutra, for instance, they will use the term Ching. The Sanskrit term for sutra in Sanskrit means thread. It means the thread which links all of this together into a fabric of meaning. And Ching originally meant the warp of cloth, just in the same way. So that a book which has the integrity of the Tao Te Ching or the I Ching is like fine cloth. And the Buddhists understood, and so they would translate the Buddhist sutras as Ching. These are like also fine plumb. But it's a Taoist understanding, not a Confucian understanding. To the Confucians, they are approved by the state, and therefore they are excellent classics. To a Taoist, they bring out the fabric of our participation with the real, and therefore they are worthy. It's that difference, that quality. So the third line brings Shang Te back. The two characters, Shang Te, occur again, like in a repetition. But where in the first arc Bu Te occurred, now a two-character phrase which rhymes with Bu Te, Wu Wei. Shang Te, Bu Te. Shang Te, Wu Wei. Wu Wei. This will wait for the machines. The third arc begins again with Shang Te and the rhyme Wu Wei. Now, Wu Wei is one of the most famous phrases in the Tao Te Ching. It's translated generally as non-action. 2122 years ago, in ancient China, in discussions held in the home of the Prince of Huainan and collected into a book called the Huainanzi, of which this is a translation of about half. It's called Tao the Great Luminant, Essays from the Huainanzi. Wu Wei. The purpose of this essay is to show that the ancient worthies strove to fulfill their duty of serving the people. In doing so, the ancient sages were adherents of Wu Wei, which literally means no action, but which really means action according to naturalness, action according to the Tao. In other words, Wu Wei is not no action. It's not doing nothing. A lot of Zen phonies in the 1970s went in for doing nothing. That's stupid. Wu Wei is acting in correspondence with the Tao, which is a zero base, so that your action is resonant with zeroness, non-recordedness. But because you are resonant with it, not in an identity sense, but in harmony, the harmony has an effect, even though you can't say exactly what the harmony is because it's a resonance of you with zero-based Tao, but its effect, nevertheless, is colossally exact. In just simple arithmetic, if you add a 0 to the number sequence, you're not counting 1, 2, 3, you're counting 10s, 20s, 30s. The effect of being resonant with the 0 means that you've moved up a whole level. If you bring 2 zeros into play, you're counting by hundreds, 200s, 300s. So that the effect of Tao being resonant with you is not no action, but it's Taoist action which has the effect that you designate. Because the Tao, because it is resonant with you, that activity bears a resonance later on. Not in what you put your hands to, but in whatever you put your hands to or whatever you put your mind to, its effect will be harmonic with you and with the Tao. The polar opposite of Wu Wei is Yu Wei, Y-U-W-E-I, Yu Wei, which is action by effort, struggling to get it done, forcing it. Squares into round holes. It will fit. Yu Wei. So that, in a way, perhaps I should use a different term, in this particular mode, Wu Wei is effortless doing. And so it was understood by Chuang-Tzu. And from Chuang-Tzu passed into Buddhism in the form of Chan Buddhism, and became the hallmark of intelligence later on in late medieval China. Chuang-Tzu writes in this way: the great way is not named. Great discriminations are not spoken. Great benevolence is not benevolent. Great modesty is not humble. Great daring does not attack. If the way is made clear, it is not the way. If discriminations are put into words, they do not suffice. If benevolence has a constant object, it cannot be universal. If modesty is fastidious, it cannot be trusted. If daring attacks, it cannot be complete. These five are all round, but they tend towards the square. In other words, there is a flow ecology, the round. But by reducing them, they tend to be square. They tend to make logical sense in terms of equivalencies, but the equivalencies are really subtle redundancies and add up to nothing real, add up to illusions. The Taoist sense is that by trying to force things, by making them square in this way, the five-phase energy cycle does not complete itself with five, but tends to want to make a sixth phase, which is disorder. And so disorder comes into play. And we'll see next week if the five-phase energy cycle moves in a harmonious way, the fifth phase folds back into the Tao seamlessly without effort and leaves no trace. So that the mind, which is capable of being harmonious with the Tao, has a harmoniousness in this world to such an extent that this world flows back into the Tao effortlessly without a trace. If that cycle of correspondences is interrupted with the insistence on equivalence, there must be a referent for this. This name occurs, therefore what's the thing? That kind of stubbornness makes ignorance and produces the tendency to want to make more than there is. And that's where the illusion comes in. It's like you don't see the world as enough, but you have to see more. And the more is this kind of out-of-focus illusion. And the only cure for it is to quiet down, to bring the correspondence with Tao into play, so that the harmony occurs, and then the double focus of this world no longer occurs. The world is only what it is what it is, and the Tao accepts. The Chinese term for something being Only what it is, exactly what it is Tzu Jan. Zu Jan. Self-soneness. And the self-soneness can be accepted by the Tao seamlessly, effortlessly. And so this world is not an impediment. It's not an evil thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not a fearful thing. It's not a reprehensible thing. It is the fifth phase, and the world is resonant with our human-hearted balance of yin-yang, which is harmonious with Tao. So the world and Tao being also in harmony because of us, bridging heaven and earth being in harmony, earth folds back into the heavens seamlessly. It's a part of it. It's this kind of equality that characterizes the Tao. So that Lao Tzu then writes, Shang Te Wu Wei, thereby pretensions. In other words, Shang Te in the third line, or the third arc, which is brought together with Wu Wei, thereby, and the word for pretensions is Wei, the same character as in Wu Wei. The same character by itself, Wei, means pretensions. If it's pronounced a different way, it can also mean river. In this case, it means pretensions. The fourth arc returns back here to inferior Te. Inferior Te, and then the character Wei, and then the character for Qi. In this sense, in the Tao Te Ching, it means itself. Inferior Te is acting itself, and then three characters that together mean but, has, thereby. And this triad of little connective characters occur now 5 different times in the 38th chapter of the Tao Te Ching. But, has, thereby. So there are going to be 5 arcs of meaning that have this little phrase, 5 lines that have this phrase, but, has, thereby. They're different phases of Te. The first is Shang Te, the second is inferior Te, the third is Shang Zhen, the fourth is Shang Yi, and the fifth is Shang Li. Now we'll see these in more detail, and you'll get to know them, and they'll be just familiar. Just like Tao is familiar with you now, Te is getting familiar, Zhen is getting familiar. Yi is the fourth phase. Just to start you off, E is what we think. E are the mental images, the symbols. The 8 trigrams in the I Ching are in that level, that phase. E. And what do they make? The E makes the principles which structure the world. Li is a principle. Li. Now the Confucians emphasize the relation between Zhen and Li, between humanity and law. Whereas the Taoists emphasize that human-heartedness and principles have a correspondence previously with Tao. To the Confucians, you can't talk about Tao, so let's not bring it into the discussion. Let's talk about man and his values codified in his principles. So a Confucian will emphasize that there is a harmony between man and his principles, and that's what makes everything work. And the Taoists say, that's right, but that harmony is possible because Tao has already harmonized with something in the Zhen. Had the Tao not harmonized with the Zhen, there would be no way that principles could harmonize with us either. Why? Because there would be the tendency for the principles to make yet another phase, a sixth phase, and because they can't, the principles are blurred. They're multiple. They occur like a drunk person trying to see something. They're out of focus. And so that's called disorder. In Taoism, that's called disorder. Chapter 38. Let's go back to the beginning. Has an introductory couplet. One about Shang Te, superior Te, and one about Xia Te, inferior Te. Then the repetition happens again, but instead of there being this pairedness at the beginning, the repetition of the pair is the introduction of 3 more lines that make the second pair a 5-fold expression. So that in effect, chapter 38 has 7 lines, or 7 arcs of meaning. Lines 1 and 2 are about superior and inferior Te. Lines 3 and 4 are about superior and inferior Te again, but because they are repeated again with a slight difference, one can say more and you can say the next 3 lines. So by 2 lines at the beginning, setting the tone for a juxtaposition that just shows that differentiation is possible. When you repeat those 2 lines with a further differentiation, it's possible then to add 3 more lines, and so you have 2 lines and then 5 lines. All talking about Te, but talking about Te by juxtaposing the talk about Te with the talk about not Te, with adding just enough new characters to spin out that when you're talking about Te, you have to be careful to be reflective and self-conscious that the talk about Te itself could mislead you. Because in each and every case, it's not the Te that's doing the talking, but you. The Te does not talk. I talk about it. And because I do, I have to remember that the Te is not what I am saying. What I am saying will have its legitimacy not in reference to Te, but in its correspondence with Tao. Now this is very subtle, but it's extremely meaningful. A good Taoist is not thinking of what he's talking about. He's not thinking about the reference and choosing his words carefully so that the words convey what he's thinking about. He's relaxing himself inside into as much equanimity as possible so his language will spontaneously bring the Tao into play. And that it does happen is retrospective proof that Te occurs. Otherwise it wouldn't happen. Now, it's very subtle, but very real. For instance, in the late 20th century, a title of a very sophisticated Chinese writing on philosophic issues is The Hall of Harmonious Wind. That's the title of his book. It means that the language that he's saying with his breath is in spontaneous sync with Tao. And the place in which he is talking, the hall, is a hall of harmonious wind. Now any Taoist will understand that this man, in this case it's a man, this man is a fine man. This man, one can bring oneself in equanimity into play with his language and build a resonance with his language. And the Tao which is resonant with you and the Tao which is resonant with him meet together in the mutual language. So instead of there being a sense of dialogue in Taoism, there's a sense of synergy of language. It's like two people singing a duet together. And one understands the other person because you have sung together. So when two Taoists meet and come to an understanding, it is sealed in, the language seals it in such a way that the correspondences and the Tao which they share is evident. Now to a Confucian, there's no such sealing by language, and so language takes the dialogue form. And all the Confucian classics have the form of somebody comes to speak to somebody else. And the rendition of what they said in the reply is the pithy wisdom. Confucius says thus and so, and we're then to understand that this is wise. To a Taoist, he hears that that language form is inelegant. It has no Tao. So he doesn't participate, because there's nothing to participate. In chapter 38, the Tao Te Ching, here's how the first 7 lines read, without any more comment, just so you can get it. Superior virtue, Shang Te, is unvirtue, therefore it has virtue. Inferior virtue not loses virtue, therefore it has no virtue. Superior virtue is non-action, and it has not thereby pretensions. Inferior virtue is acting itself and has thereby pretensions. Superior benevolence is acting itself, but has not thereby pretends. Superior righteousness acting itself, but has thereby pretensions. Superior propriety is acting itself, but when no one's to it responds, then it stretches its arm and enforces it. So the first 7 lines of the 38th chapter of the Tao Te Ching are saying this. Shang Te, Bu Te, therefore has Te. Inferior Te not loses Te, therefore it has no Te. This Shang Te, through Wu Wei, thereby there are no pretensions. The inferior Te, acting itself, but it has thereby pretensions. In other words, it's not acting in resonance. It's acting as if it acted itself. And that's always for pretense. It's grandstanding. Oh, well, I've done this all by myself. Pretensions. Superior human-heartedness, Shang Zhen, is acting itself, but not thereby pretends. Why is it acting itself, not thereby pretends? Because when superior human-heartedness is acting itself, it's acting in resonance with Tao. So, not thereby does it pretend. Superior righteousness, Shang-Yi, is acting itself but has thereby pretensions. And fifth, and finally, superior propriety, Shang-Li, is acting itself, but when no one to it responds, then it stretches forth its arm and enforces it. Let's take a break here and just turn these off for just a moment. Ted, we're going to take a break here for just a moment.
I don't know what to do with it.
That is here in the 38th chapter. The first is Shang Te. The second is called Inferior Te, but nevertheless is still a Te. The third is Shang Zhen. The fourth is Shang Yi. Yi is translated as righteousness. And the fifth is Shang Li, translated as propriety. Now in Confucius, Li is always principle and not propriety, and it's just a way of showing that the language of Lao Tzu is before Confucius. Lao Tzu is born about 600 BC. Confucius is born about 50 years later. The apocryphal story, which is recorded of Confucius meeting the old Lao Tzu, is that when he comes out, he says, I don't understand because the man is a dragon. And I couldn't follow what he was saying. And in fact, replying to him, the Taoists remembered that Lao Tzu, observing the old etiquette of ancient China by walking the man out with language, said, I've heard it said that a man of wealth and power makes parting gifts of money, and that the good man makes parting gifts of words. I could never be a man of wealth and power, but I sometimes dare to think myself a good man. So I will show you out with a few words which are as follows. The man who is intelligent and clear-sighted will soon die, for his criticisms of others are just. The man who is learned and discerning risks his life, for he exposes others' faults. The man who is a son no longer belongs to himself. The man who is a subject no longer belongs to himself. And so you notice the kind of pithy approximation of parallels, of correspondences, put into corresponding sequences. And so Lao Tzu always builds his language in this way. He will present a couple of Chinese characters, or sometimes just one, sometimes a phrase of several. And then without any ceremony, he will juxtapose another resonant character, couple of characters, block of characters making a phrase. Then he will draw something out from that in a character or a couple of characters or a phrase. Then he will bring another line into play, matching that, having a slight similarity, yet having a little bit of a difference. And then the sequence will unfold just a little bit differently, and what he draws out of it will be very frequently polar opposite or related in a kind of sequencing. So that as you pick up the cues of structure, Lao Tzu's language begins to unfold for you in a kind of a geometric meaning, so that you don't just understand the words and the phrases, but you understand the juxtapositions, and then finally you turn the juxtapositions into this sphere of resonances, so that the mind of Lao Tzu is empatheatrical. Empatheatrical. He presents you with a bare stage, then he'll put a character on the bare stage, and then he'll make you be aware that the bare stage with the characters occurring within a theater. This is the way that he moves. So his language will always give you a kind of a cue setting. Then he will put some kind of a juxtaposition there which indicates that you're now needing to make these differentiations, bring yourself into play with this emerging gestalt. And then the meaning that he draws out will be a meaning which only you, in the integrity of your intuition, will be able to fill out. Because the written language will not have any connectors that will make it happen. If you don't make it happen by being empatheatrical yourself, you will not understand what the language has done. And you will end up saying, well, the words are there, but I don't know what it means. It's this kind of quality. Let me finish up with this. This is the end of chapter 38. I'm going to give it to you in my translation so that you can hear how Lao Tzu's language unfolds this empatheatricality in the following way. Therefore, when one loses Tao, and then there is Te, one loses Te, and then there is Gen, one loses Gen, and then there is righteousness, E, and then one loses righteousness, E, and then there is Li, principle. Now, principle, Li, these things are loyalty and faith in their externality and disorder in its beginning. Premature knowledge that is Tao is a mere flower, and ignorance is in this beginning. Therefore, the great, large organizer, the Ta Chang Fu, dwells in its there-ness, but abides not in the externality, abides in the fruit, but not in the flower. Therefore, she avoids the latter and chooses the former. Now, all of this that we've talked about tonight is just one chapter, one section of the Tao Te Ching. Stick with it. You'll find a better place. But you're building up a tolerance. It'll become easier and easier and easier. And after a couple of months, it'll seem like second nature to you. Lao Tzu will seem like the clearest of all possible writers. And you will have a moment of great embarrassment, because you will understand him limpidly, clearly, and when you try to tell someone else and you see the look on their face that they don't hear a thing that you have said. And you have to have compassion and deep-heartedness, because it will occur to you, if they can't understand something so simple, how stupid must they be? They're not stupid. It's just that they haven't ever settled into themselves in language to where they could hear something that's simply true. And when you can, there is a kind of a purity of spirit that begins to occur for a while. Lao Tzu, Chuang-Tzu, all of the Taoists say this is the true person. You in that mode, that's who you really are. That personable quality is capable of eternity, capable of becoming a Shen, an eternal spirit. For there is no limit, there is no boundary where decay could set in and decompose it. Because the gestalt which you finally are is Tao itself. We'll see what we can do next week.